What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Coffee and Van Chats. I'm sitting here with Angus Morton, otherwise known as Gus Morton. He is the founder or co-founder, I guess, of Thereabouts and is a part of the PSYO podcast, Put Your Socks On with Velo News and Bobby Ulick. And yeah, Gus, how you doing, man?
I'm doing well, John. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. So you're in Colorado right now, right?
I am, yeah. Boulder, Colorado is home base.
You guys getting dumped on with snow right about now?
No, we're not actually. Unfortunately, really? No, we're not. We've had it's threatening, but we haven't had any substantial snow. I've recently gotten into skiing and like ski mountaineering, and so I'm hanging to be able to get up in the mountains and do some proper skiing. And the snow's been pretty abysmal thus far, so I'm praying for snow.
Right on. Yeah, I'm in the springs. It's funny how the weather works in Colorado, and like some parts it's super sunny, it's rideable. Other parts it's like 6 inches of snow, but it can be wild. It can be all over the place, especially around this time. But
yeah, totally.
But anyways, let's dive into it, man. I really want to get to know where the cycling passion even comes from. I mean, for many people that know you and your brother, I mean, there's more to cycling than just the bike. Like, I mean, you guys have made this, as cliche as it sounds, a lifestyle. I mean, it's a part of your guys' life, and it'll always be a part of your life. It doesn't seem like it was ever a job. So where does the passion even stem from? Where does it come from, and how did it all start?
Yeah, that's a good question. Sorry.
No, you're good.
So I grew, Lockie and I, my family, we grew up on a small farm on a river on the mid-north coast, east coast of Australia, in New South Wales, a place called Port Macquarie. And Dad was big into motor racing. Had been kind of, pre birth of his children, and so, we kind of inherited that from birth. One of my earliest memories is of Dad waking me up at 2 o'clock in the morning to let me know that Ant and Senna had been killed in a motor racing accident, because I was in love with him, and I would have been. Wow. I think that was that was early 90s, right? So I was sort of 3 or 4 years of age, probably. So like it was in our blood, and Dad was. We had family friends lived down the road, who were they were a motor racing family as well, and so they got motorbikes, and the older brother was a couple of years older, and so he sort of got a motorbike at like 5 or 6 years of age, and so then I got a motorbike at the same time. So I was sort of on a motorbike at like 4 years of age, racing around on the motorbike, and those motorbikes gradually got bigger and we got faster, and we sort of moved into the farm truck, and we were rallying the farm truck around, and I guess it got to a point where we just had a few too many accidents. Yeah. And we were we'd kind of were progressing into the go-karts. We're going to move into go-karts and start racing go-karts at sort of 8 years of age. And obviously the parents, had some sort of a meeting, and they were like, there's no way the boys should be racing go-karts together. They'll kill themselves. And so they decided to stagger us a year apart. And that meant that we, or me, like I had to sit a year out from being able to race, like ride my motorbike or race go-karts. And I'd seen myself as being a Formula One driver at that point. Like that's what I was going to be. And I was, as I said, obsessed with cars, and everything I did and thought about was cars. And so I had no motorbike. Wasn't getting a go-kart. I was like, well, like, what can I do? And at least the way it works in my mind, how this plays out, which, it's probably not quite as compressed as this, but I sort of remember Dad basically explaining to me that I wasn't going to get a go-kart that year, and I was going to have to sit it out for the 9 months or something. And I sort of turned around. It was on a Saturday morning, and there on the TV station SBS, which is sort of like a semi-public television station in Australia, was an ad for the Tour de France. And it was, all of the colors of the peloton racing by, these beautiful mountain vistas, and they were going fast. They looked like they were going like quite fast. And I sort of was like, I looked at it and I was like, damn, like they look like they're going pretty quick. I've got a bike underneath the house. Maybe I can go as quick. And so I, went downstairs, got on this old Malvern Star, chromoly. It was like a metallic red color, and had this kind of like almost like vein kind of graphic, like lava kind of graphic things on it. And I went out in front of the house onto the street, and I sprinted down the road, and I sprinted, and then coasted, and was kind of like, oh yeah, like I nearly get that sense of like it was on the motorbike, right? I kind of get that sense of speed. And then I turned around and sprinted back, and that was that. I sort of decided then and there that, you know what, I can kind of get a kick out of going quick on a pedal bike, and that's going to have to do. And then for whatever reason, it was sort of like, well, let's ride it down to the dirt. I lived on an island, and so it was kind of a bridge, and then there was a dirt road, maybe a mile and a half down. And so I'd ride down to the dirt road and back, and then it progressed further and further. And then a year passed, and Dad was like, do you want to get your go-kart and start go-kart racing? And I said, well, can I get a racing bike and start racing? And he was like, sure. And yeah, the rest is history, as they say.
Wow. And then I guess Lachlan had to follow form, huh? And so,
right.
And so that kind of folds us into like, because we're going to come back to your kind of your cycling career, but it folds into kind of thereabouts. Like, I mean, I love the analogy of just, I rode to a dirt road, and then all of a sudden I went past the dirt road and went further. And so thereabouts, where does that even come from? And had you and Lachlan been planning that even pre, you guys being professional on the bike?
Not at all. So yeah, to give you like the background on thereabouts, I guess it probably kicked off like an idea that was started with Lockie in I don't know, maybe like July of 2013.
Yeah.
Maybe a little bit earlier than that. He was in Europe racing his first season on the world tour. He was like 21 years old. And, he'd been taking a beating over there, and was, he was just, trying to fit in, I guess, and get the hang of it, and was sort of like, I think sort of having a bit of a tough time, and kind of reached out to me and was like, oh, we should do like a bike trip together at the end of the year. And, and where we just like ride. And at first it was in Thailand. He's like, there's these mountains in Thailand. We could do this big mountain ride. And I was sort of like, I'd stopped racing at 21. So I was 23 at this time. I was working in TV. I was directing my first TV show, a TV show called The Hamster Wheel, which was a political satire sketch comedy show, and I was one of the sketch directors on it. And I was sort of like, again, hadn't touched the bike, hadn't done any real exercise for several years, and I was like, my association with like traveling by bike was middle-aged German cyclotourists. It wasn't something that was exciting. It wasn't something that was sort of fast and nimble. It was this very slow, labored process. You wear daggy clothes and flappy hats, and you've got these great big ugly panniers on your bikes, and you're a very upright position, all that sort of stuff. So I was sort of like, I couldn't really wrap my head around it. And a few months passed. Lockie reached out again and was like, we should do this trip. Let's do it. But let's do it in Australia. And he'd had a really successful season. He'd won the leaders jersey at the Tour of Colorado for several days. Same thing at the Tour of Utah. I think he'd won a stage at the Tour of Utah. So like, you know, he was having a breakout year, but was still not totally, you know, hadn't found his place in the World Tour and was still kind of a restless soul, I guess. And I was sort of feeling a little bit the same doing what I was doing, you know, in making television. And I didn't really have an outlet for creativity, unfettered, you know, being able to do my own thing, my own way, right? And so he sort of was like, well, let's ride across Australia. Like, let's ride to Uluru, which is the center of Australia. And I, you know, TV work's contract work, so usually you've got the month of Christmas off. And I was like, well, I've got December off. I was coming back from the States, coming back from the US, and I was like, let's do it. And anyway, and not really necessarily thinking about it, but sort of like, you know, I probably should get on a bike and do something physical and kind of get a bit healthy. I hadn't been living a very healthy lifestyle or much of moderation. And so I came back, and the day I landed, we went for a ride. I think I was on like maybe his Cervelo or something or other. I was on, anyway, we went for a training ride, and it was 2 hours long, and I went the worst hunger flat I've ever gone in my life. Anyone who knows, like, bonking.
Oh man.
And dude, it was like an hour in, and I was like completely destroyed. And I was sort of like, oh my God. And that was the start. And then we did, that was the start. And then we did we trained for like a month, and we sort of built up to like doing 4 or 5 hour days. And I started getting moving. And then about a week, sort of 10 days before we had like vaguely planned on doing the trip, we said, well, like, let's actually do it. And, you know, contacted a guy that Lockie had worked with that sort of would do his motor pacing and massage and bits and pieces. He's kind of fixer. And so we contacted him and was like, well, you know, would you sort of take 2 weeks and drive a car with us while we ride to Uluru? And he was sort of like, I guess so. and so, yeah. And then a couple of days before we set off, you know, my motivation to do the trip was I wanted to shoot a series of a portrait book, where you would photograph all of these different characters that you meet out on the road, and then just do, you know, 250 words on them, and the bikers, that sort of. So like that was kind of my thinking, and Lockie was like, we just wanted to have an adventure, and then you know, right before we sort of left, we're like, well, if we film a little bit, if we can cut together like, you know, a minute long piece of like, you know, great visuals and just like a cool soundtrack, maybe we can like get some flights from like a sponsor like Cervelo or someone that, you know, like he was on Garmin Sharp at the time, or Garmin or someone, and we can like maybe do more of these trips and we don't have to pay for them. It was sort of the thinking.
That's kind of funny from you just saying that. It's like, yeah, maybe if we just put together a minute film, and now you have like 3 of them at what, 45 minutes a piece. So it's a production in itself. So that's kind of funny to talk about. But let's dive back into your cycling career. Like you rode with Drac Pack development team, and it looks like you pretty much stayed with the same team like when you went pro. At least the first time around. Why was that? And then why did you stop? Like why did you shut it down?
Yeah, that's a good question. I went to the Junior World Championships as a first year junior, so like 16, 17 years of age, and you do a European kind of tour, and then you do the Worlds. And I'd been racing in the States prior to that, and had done well, did well in Europe, crashed out of the Worlds, but had done well in races on the lead up to that, and came home and was kind of like started to build up again for the next season, but I wasn't feeling the pressure of being at that world's level. And anyway, long story short, I like took myself out of contention for the national team. And, you know, I sort of said, like, I don't want to go. I would rather do school and sort of figure out my own sort of shit. I ended up going to those selection races and doing well. And I had a pretty good season. Anyway, a good season in the US. And then raced as a stagiaire with the Drapac Porsche team at the end of the season, and got some good results in the open races.
Yeah.
A couple of top fives and some sort of anyway. And it had always been my dream at the time. There was a team called SouthAustralia.com, which was the Australian Institute of Sport. And they had a development team. And this was sort of the era of, I was the same age or a year younger than like Cam Meyer. There was Travis Meyer, Bob Ridge.
Was it more track based back then?
It was track. Yeah, it was more track based because Australia had won. Like the funding structure was basically like in Australian sport was sort of like, what have we got the best chance of winning medals at? Mm-hmm. Let's put money towards those. And it was sort of based off of the previous Olympic cycle. And so cycling, we'd done typically quite well in cycling since the early 90s. And, you know, like Brownie, O'Grady, Roberts, like, you know, Steve Woolridge, all of these really cool bike riders had come through before and paved the way anyway. So that it was a predominantly track based program. And to be honest, like I really hated the track. I raced it, and, you know, had done well, won national medals and bits and pieces, at that level, but I really just didn't enjoy the track. My heart was set on the road. Anyway, so I really had my heart set on making that team. And anyway, coming towards the end of my junior year, I was about to go into the under 23s, and Drapac, Michael Drapac, approached me. And at the time, my parents ran a junior development program where they would, there was about 7 or so under 17s, under 15s, and under 17s on the team, and they would give them bikes. They would sort of take them to races, and they also would give them a 6-week program in the US where the program was kind of focused on teaching these kids how to be self-sufficient. So, you know, they would rent a house for the team in the US, and they would go like, there's the race program, you know, here's your weekly budget for food. The house needs to be clean. You obviously need to be fed, and you need to be entered and organized to get to these races. And then on top of that, you had to stay on top of your school. And so it was really this program. It was amazing program. We all lived in this house. Everyone had, you know, you'd cook for 3 days, and then you would do the washing for 3 days, and then you would do the cleaning of the house for 3 days, and you would sort of rotate, and you would have to enter and organize and select as a team which races you were going to do, and, you know, what training everyone was doing. There was like a time to leave, all this sort of stuff. So it was really, you know, a really amazing program. It taught you a lot of independence. I also think ultimately, like, it led a lot of people to decide that maybe being a professional athlete wasn't exactly what they wanted, and that they became more interested in their school and these other pursuits.
Which isn't always a bad thing. Yeah.
Which is not at all. Anyway, so Michael had some young kids on the Drapac team, Tom Palmer, Sarah Kent, who were world champions, and needed a place to kind of put them because they weren't old enough to be in the world team. And anyway, so long story short, realized the kids and Drapac kind of joined forces and took on a bunch of their young athletes, and would take them to the US and would kind of run that more development focused program that was more on, you know, shaping you as a human being and teaching you independence and work ethic, planning, all of that sort of like organizational skills, that sort of thing. Anyway, so there was like an offer for me to go and race with Drapac. I would earn a salary. Part of the conditions of that program was that I would have to go to university, which I had been, you know, I'd left school full-time to do it part-time via distance education or homeschool in order to race.
Was that for all the athletes?
No, this is just
shoot.
what I'd done because I got
Okay.
kicked out of school.
Okay.
I got kicked out of school because I just didn't go
Yeah.
because I was just training all the time, and
There you go.
and I didn't really care about school, to be honest.
Yeah.
Like it was something that, you know, like I'd always succeeded at. When they kicked me out of school, I was at the top of the grade in you know, a couple of subjects and was in that top sort of 20%. So anyway, so it was I was like, well, I'm getting the grades. Why
Why
do you
go?
need to kick me out?
Yeah.
Anyway, so as a defiance, I said, well, fuck you, and I left and was doing homeschool. So you're not really learning with homeschool, to be honest. And
Yeah.
anyway, so the thought of going to university was like something mum and dad had always said that I had to do, but it didn't necessarily excite me at the time. And then South Australia, the AIS also gave me an offer, and the AIS had more success in translating, you know, these under 23 athletes into World Tour athletes, and they had a more European-based program. So in my mind, that was sort of the program that I had always had my heart set on and really, really wanted to do. But at the same time, all of a sudden, there's Michael Drapak coming along, and he's sort of like, there's more to life than bike riding. Not only that, but like, you know, here's all this really interesting, you know, groundbreaking kind of science on nutrition and like mental health and like all of these. And all of a sudden, I was becoming interested in all of these other elements that were kind of performance, I guess, like rooted in performance, but also too in innovation and also too just in academia. Anyway, so like long story short, it was like a do or die kind of moment. I needed to make the decision. It was the morning before a bike race called the Sydney to the Goulburn to Sydney. It's a big bike race in Australia, and I said no. I'm going to go with Drapak. I was stagiairing with Drapak. I was like in the hotel with Drapak, and like my coach is on the phone to like the AIS, and they're like trying to negotiate this thing. And anyway, I went with Drapak. We won that race that day with Robbie Williams, who was an incredible bike rider, incredible human being. And I was 12th or something, but I was caught very close to the finish line. I was in the break with Robbie. And so I had a really good result. Went on, signed with Drapak, did my first race as a professional, sort of full-time with them, was the Tour of Qatar. And that was like a major learning curve. You know, crosswinds, you're racing, you know, Tom Boonen, Mark Cavendish, all of these exceptional bike riders. And you know, my experience of crosswinds was Belgium as a junior, and that's not at all what it's like when you race with the big boys. But it was awesome. And, you know, I eked out a few kind of semi-good results there in terms of just, you know, being in that front group when that front group was, you know, 30 guys or so. And so that was, you know, that was encouraging. And then following that race, I went to a race called the Tour of Taiwan, got a parasite, got super, super sick, got pneumonia, and didn't really recover from that for the rest of the season. They couldn't really work out what was wrong with me. And so that was the first experience where, you know, I'd kind of, I guess, gone into this team. I thought, you know, yeah, I'm going to progress, yada, yada. And then all of a sudden, like, you know, I just couldn't get out of my own way.
Yeah.
And so that made me start thinking about school and like, you know, what I was going to do with that. And that kind of led me to, you know, like where am I going to go to university and what am I going to do here? And so I sort of like, I didn't really get many options when it came to getting into school. And, you know, I actually sat my final exams for school. I don't know what they're called here in the US. Is it maybe SATs?
Yeah.
But it's sort of what qualifies you for college. I actually sat one of those exams. I had to get like a special order, and I sat it the morning before the Herald Sun Tour time trial.
Oh, wow.
And so I sat it in the morning. My time trial start time was like 2 p.m. The exam was from like 9 until 11 or 10 until 12 or something. And so I did that, and then I got like a police escort from the school where I sat the exam, to the race, warmed up, raced the
President
race.
Morton. Yeah.
Yeah. So like it was it wasn't ideal. But anyway, but the point is that kind of season opened my eyes, and I was like, oh, maybe I need some sort of a fallback for my cycling career, because, it's sort of, my health was really up and down. And so I chose film, to study film at university, I think, because it was sort of straddling that idea of like what would be fun and engaging for me at school, still thinking that I was going to be a bike rider, but, giving myself a degree and that sort of thing. So I studied, I chose a communications, journalism and film major, and started going down that path. And at the same time I was racing, and my interests kind of more and more were pulling me towards, I guess, we raced a lot in Asia, we raced in Europe, and of course in Australia, and my interests were like pulling me more and more towards the characters that I would meet surrounding the bike races I was at. Not so much, like, my interest didn't really lie in the racing itself.
Yeah.
And so I kind of got to the end of, I'd done a stint in Europe, and my contract was up, and like Drapac wanted to renew, and then also Garmin, whatever the feeder team, the under 23 team for Garmin was called at the time, 5280, I think, wanted me to kind of go and race there. And I was like, I kind of thought to myself for a second, like, do I really like this? As I'd sort of been studying film, I realized that, and journalism, there's a way to make a living out of telling stories, and I was more interested in that. And so I just said, no, I'm not gonna renew. I'm not gonna take any of these contract offers, and I'm just gonna go and study, and I'm gonna work in TV, and which is crazy.
Yeah, because I did not expect that answer. Like, I kind of expected you not to have any contract offers like most people, and they were kind of forced out of it.
No. So I had options, and which was fortunate. But the other thing that made me leave, because I would have, like, and I was close to taking, like, in hindsight, I sort of can't believe that I didn't take a contract, because, having known how hard it is now to, like, try and do what I've done. Like, anyway, but at the same time, my interest doesn't lie in racing bikes for a living. And so I think, like, one of the big motivators too was, like, I'm very lucky, I'm very privileged to be able to have options on the table when, to be honest, like, I hadn't really fulfilled my potential as an athlete. In those years of racing, there'd been glimpses of it, but getting my shit together, be that getting my health together, or on the other side, getting my head together, because there was a lot of, like sort of this mental battle that had been playing out for years in my head about whether bike riding was what I wanted to do, but then that was all I knew. And so anyway, long story short was basically, I was like, well, I'd be taking up a spot on someone else who really, 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 really wants this, and, like, really, really, really deserves a shot. Whereas I'd be taking it, and I'd only be giving it 90%, and it deserves 100%. So, like, that was another factor in my decision at the time. And I think that's actually what I said to Drapac. I was like, I'd be taking someone else's spot. And I was like, you don't want me on the team. Like, I'm not,
How old were you at the time?
I just turned 21.
21, man. Like,
yeah. And
I feel like cycling ages people super quick. Like, just like almost.
It doesn't.
Yeah.
Like, and that was one thing, like, you get thrown into this adult world from a really young age. And you kind of have to dedicate yourself to things in a really wholehearted way, which normally as a kid, you don't really have to do that. You get to kind of sample these things, but I really made that decision when I was sort of 14 years of age that I was going to be a professional athlete, younger even. And so like, I think on that element, you know, you're very regimented, you're very dedicated, you're very organized, you're very forward thinking. But then on other ways, like you don't know how to, you know, like people wash your clothes, people book your flights, people like organize all of your other shit. So like all of these other areas of my life, I was like very immature in.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was areas that you're super mature in. And so it's sort of weird. You become kind of institutionalized to a degree within that world, which I think is a big issue in and of itself. And like in the sport as a whole. So I think like it is weird in that regard. I think you're both very mature, but also very immature.
Well, yeah. Well, kind of on that note, why did you go back? Like after your first Thereabouts, you've gotten this
Mm-hmm.
taste of just freedom on the bike. Where your brother's questioning even racing at that level ever again, even if he gets a contract, or even if he took a contract, turned it down. I don't know what happened in that situation, but it sounds like you left on your terms the first time, which many cyclists don't get to do. So then to go back, do you feel like you left on your terms again, or do you still feel like there's some unfinished business, I guess, in the professional cycling world for Angus Morton?
Yeah. So the reason I went back to racing in the first place, I'd been given some advice. I was working on a pilot for a television drama, which I don't know if it ever got made, to be honest. I was just helping out. I was working as an edit assistant at the time, and I was just helping out a director that worked in the same production company that I was working at. And he was like, what do you want to do? And I was like, I want to be a director. And I'm like, I'm fucking going to be one, you know, real soon. And like, I was like 22 at the time. I had no idea really what I was talking about. And anyway, he said, well, can I give you one piece of advice? And he was sort of like this old school, pretty hardcore Irish TV director, and he'd seen some things. And he said to you, can I give you some advice? And I said, sure. You know, in my mind, I was like, there's no way I'm taking advice. No one can give me advice. Like this usual arrogant shit when you're a kid. And he said to me, leave. He said, go away for 10 years and do anything else but directing, but working in television. He said, because you know nothing. He's like, you know nothing about what it is to live. You know nothing about what it is to experience anything in the stories, in the stories that you hope to tell. He's like, if you want to tell real, emotional, engaging stories, he's like, you need to be able to have empathy. You need to be able to understand where people are coming from. And he's like, you're not going to get that by directing. You're only going to get that by living. And so he said, so go away for 10 years, come back, and then you can be a director. He's like, but until then, he's like, you're only selling yourself short. And I was sort of like, whatever. And sure enough, not much time passed. And I found, you know, it was within a year, I found myself directing a sketch comedy show. And I was like, you know, you get asked the question a lot, you know, what show would you make? What do you want to make? You know, what would you? And I was like, I don't fucking know. I was like, I don't know the story that I want to tell yet. Like, I don't have anything, you know, I'm learning the craft, but like, I don't have anything that I have enough conviction about that I would want to make, to tell, right? I didn't have a voice. To his point, I didn't have experience. I didn't feel that I had the qualification to tell any one particular story of my own, right? And so, you know, I was sort of feeling that and feeling a little bit, I guess, out of my depth in that regard, you know, and everything was going well in that career trajectory, you know, in terms of where I was at and what I was sort of doing, but I didn't feel comfortable in like, you know, taking that next step and going from just someone who's hired to basically take someone else's writing and convert that onto screen. And so anyway, so I was, you know, take that and then to do something where it's like, it's your own and you're involved in all of that creative process. And so anyway, so then long story short, Lockie obviously comes along. We start riding again. And so it was a combination of me being like, I need more experience in life experience. I need to sort of say yes to more things and kind of take, these things in. And then as we got riding, I started getting good and I started moving well. And I was like, man, there's some unfinished business in cycling. I had all of these kind of hang-ups when I was there last time. I had like lots of issues with like eating and weight that had really fucked with me, and overtraining and these other sort of hang-ups that a lot of young athletes develop when they're in that pressure cooker and they don't really have the maturity and the self-awareness to be able to step back and really observe what's going on and be like, am I doing the right thing here? Am I listening to reason? And so I was like, yeah, I've got some unfinished business and I need to experience more of the world, and the opportunity to do that and to race alongside my brother would be amazing. And so, and he was looking to find a place that he fit a little bit better than in the World Tour. And so, we sort of put the feelers out and found a team at Jelly Belly with Danny and Maddie, and they, they wholeheartedly embraced what we wanted to do. And by that stage, the Thereabouts film had come out, and we had, I had really begun to think, more broadly about what the bike can be. It's not just a race machine. It's not just a performance machine. It's not just something people use to get in shape for whatever else it is that they do in their lives. It is something that can really teach you about the world. It can really show you and provide a perspective that you couldn't get in any other way or from anybody else. And so, sort of taking that perspective, and then obviously the storytelling and film perspective, and wanting to kind of get some experience and look from the inside of the sport of cycling. And so, yeah, I, trained for a year whilst I was working full time and on a television show. And then, kind of told my bosses, I was like, oh, I don't think you know this about me, but I used to be a cyclist and I've been offered a job and I'm going to go back and do that for a living. And they're like, what? And so that's what I did. And then raced alongside Lockie for 2 years. Got some amazing results. We set out when I first made the decision to come back, we set out to win the Tour of Colorado because that's our home race. At that stage, my parents had been living in the US in Boulder, Colorado for a long time. And we'd grown up in Colorado, spending the summers here. And that was what we wanted to win. And then, that race got canceled. But the Tour of Utah was also, next state over. So it's kind of the home race. And so that was that was the next goal. We wanted to win Tour of California, and Lockie crashed out. And then we went to Utah and we won that race. And that was a real honor to be able to ride alongside Lockie in that support role. And to do that, and to be able to share that victory, and to be able to do it in the way that we did it. We were down and out, or he was, down and out, and we sort of went all in on the last stage and won that race, and it came down to the entire team. It came down to thinking through a strategy, being nimble on the road, and all these other things. And so once I executed that, it was like, okay, that's tick that box. Now what? I was like, well, maybe I can get it to the World Tour. And, I'd finished top 10 in like Tour of Alberta and things like that. So I had some kind of semi-good results, but nothing incredible. And then in that so then Lockie went back to the World Tour, and I had one more season on my contract with Jelly Belly. And dude, I just overdid it and cooked myself and really couldn't get it out of my own way. Got really sick towards the end of the year. And then also too, like a bunch of young guys had died in racing or outside of racing. And I had really begun to think about something Michael Drapak had said to me 15 years earlier, or maybe not that long. That's like 10 years earlier, 12 years earlier, when I was 16 years of age. And he had said, Gus, what is the point of sport? And I was like, mate, I didn't say this, but I was like, I don't know. It's like to inspire people. It's to, it's to like to provide a spectacle and entertainment and all these sort of things. He said, Gus, sport exists for the betterment of society. And he's like, if it doesn't serve that purpose, then it shouldn't exist. And I was sort of like, you know, at the time, kind of like, whatever, Michael, you know,
Yeah.
I was like, yeah, right. And what he was really saying there was like that it's not about the athlete, it's about the audience, and it's about the general population. And, you know, as you probably well know, like being an athlete is very self-centered. It's very self-serving. And particularly when you get in those environments, in a professional environment where it's about money, it's about victory, you know, all of a sudden you're like, I sort of had this moment where I looked around at, you know, the racing that we were doing and the people and what everyone kind of was arguing about and what everyone was kind of trying to achieve. And you're like, does this really serve to benefit society? And I was like, there's absolutely no way this serves to benefit society. You know, you were looking at Chris Froome was in the Tour de France getting urine thrown on him. And you're like, how is this bringing people together? How is this making the world a better place? And I'm like, it's not. It doesn't. I was like, this system's broken, right? Like from not even examining closely, like actually how broken the sport of cycling is, be that the funding model, be that like, you know, the governing body, be that athlete rights, be that, you know, diversity, be that like all of these things that are, you know, are quite clearly issues within sport. So I sort of was then like, well, towards the end of that time, I was like, well, what are ways in which sport could potentially benefit society? And like, how can we explore these? How can we make these case studies? And that was, so again, had a contract to continue on with Jelly Belly. There was absolutely no interest from the World Tour, and not, you know, not too many other people, to be honest. But I had, you know, the opportunity to continue on and to keep racing my bike. I was 28, so I was by no means old, and I was like, do you know what, guys? Like, I enjoy this. I would love to keep doing it, but I'm too comfortable here. And I have other things that I want to explore within sport that aren't this. And, you know, so that was the birth of what became the Outskirts series. And really the idea of Outskirts was, my thinking was, again, to create a case study where it's like, what's the antithesis of World Tour racing? And that's, you know, that's touring by bike, where there's no epic physical feat really attached to it. There's no finish line and no victor. And the purpose isn't about the riders. The purpose is about the characters and the people and the way in which the bike can introduce you to that world. So the bike really was a storytelling tool. It wasn't the story. And so that was kind of the premise of that series. And then whether or not it fully lived up to that, I think in its moments it did, and then in its other moments it definitely didn't. Yeah. But that's for a whole number of factors, I think. But the original idea was to do these unsupported journeys where we would film by bike, and, you know, and that's where the partnership came with Rafa, Specialized, and Envy, and Wahoo, and a few other brands that really bought into that way of thinking. And to be honest, I think it's really far out there in terms of like the traditional, I guess,
it's so far out there. Like, I think,
messaging.
Like, you guys, like, between you, Taylor Finney, I mean, you had every 17 and 18-year-old wearing flannels on rides. And I literally listened to a podcast the other day of Cameron Wharf, you know, giving you a rough time about showing up to a ride with you and Geraint Thomas. Like, yeah. I think that's hilarious. It's like, yeah, you want to come ride with Geraint Thomas and me? Yeah, sure. And I just picture you showing up in just a t-shirt and some, you know, black shorts, and just like, where are we meeting this guy? And that's the guy.
Right. Yeah.
Right
on. That was funny.
That's awesome. And so diving into that, like, you've cultivated this, I would like to say, culture, which is very beautiful for the sport, because it's kind of relaxed people a bit, with with that. And I think it's opened up a model in the sport of cycling to kind of be a little bit more welcoming. And I think gravel culture has that. I think little parts of cycling has that, but Thereabouts and Outskirts has definitely opened that. I mean, how do you go about picking the crew? I mean, every crew that you've had has been great. I mean, with Jacob Rath and like, I mean, between you and your brother, and like, I mean, it's a cool, like, you have a cool wide group of people. So how do you kind of go about that?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Like with the first film that we made, it was about Lockie and I.
Yeah.
And we didn't really intend that to be, and that was a very weird experience. You know, like I had kind of dedicated my life to being behind camera.
Yeah.
And have found myself on it. And, you know, I think there's value in that story. But after that, I was like, holy shit, like we'd had this experience. Let's get people on and then make it about them. And we like host this interaction, and we like unpack these characters over the course of these endurance rides. And we introduce them to these people that they would never normally talk to. And as a result of that, they start thinking about themselves and their place in the world and all of these other things. And so that was Cam Worth and Taylor Finney. And then the third one was about Colombia and about going down and meeting the cycling characters of Colombia and kind of looking into that space a little bit. And then with Outskirts, I really wanted it to be like, because it's sort of like, where do you go from there, you know? Mm-hmm. And it really then became about like, well, again, the antithesis. I'm like, all of these brands and these and this industry is really concerned with like who's winning and like these characters and what's your pedigree and all that sort of stuff. And I'm like, no. I want to show that, like, you know, people that you've never heard of can be the central characters. And I want, you know, that to be the point. These people that you've never heard of, I want you to kind of be able to engage with them and to sort of use the name of Thereabouts to lure people in, and then kind of demonstrate that, like, that, you know, that anybody can have these experiences, and that everybody does have these experiences and on the bike. And so that was really the motivation behind that, the first Outskirts. And then the second Outskirts, you know, we'd had like quite a wide range of people, and we were looking very far reaching, and ultimately, you know, you've got obligations to sponsors and bits and pieces like that. So that kind of, you know, guided the kind of characters that we were able to bring, which it is, you know, that's like a fact of, you know, those sort of relationships, and that's fine. So that led us to Rathy and to Dan Craven, who are absolute legends and really interesting characters. And I also think too, like, even within the cycling world and the racing world, like, are two characters that I think are very interesting and are very valuable, but aren't necessarily like that A-list type character. So I think from my perspective is, at least with those films, it was about finding characters that I'd had an interaction with at one point or another, or like someone had told me about, that I'm like, wow, maybe they would provide a unique perspective on the sport, and be a really interesting guest in their interaction with the people that we, you know, come across and meet. So like in that regard, it's very much, it's very much just like, you know, who do we find interesting? There's no real criteria, I guess, if I think about it.
Your email hopefully is going to blow up after this, you know.
Yeah,
just
and look, we
want to be a part of it.
And we do, and we have like, and it's funny, like, you know, from all sorts of levels. And to be honest, like, when it comes to this sort of thing, like, I'm most comfortable and I'm most intrigued by the people that you've never heard of, the characters that, like, whether, you know, that you meet sitting at the bar, or that you meet like at the gas station, outside the gas station, or at your hotel in the morning before you ride off. Like, that's who fascinates me. Like, we've all heard the A-listers stories, and there's 100 outlets that do that and do it well. So it's sort of like, I don't I'm not as interested in telling those stories of those characters. I'm more interested in like these random people, these everyday people. And so like for me, that's, to be honest, like where my heart goes with these sort of things, is like, who are those people that we can have along potentially, and you know, that can provide a novel perspective on the sport, or on you know, two-wheel travel that we haven't thought of before.
Well, that being said, you know, who's someone on the road, like not cyclist? I mean, you know, if you guys want to go check out these documentaries, I'll put a link in the description below, but not a cyclist, but who is somebody that you've met on the road that you'll never forget? Because that was one favorite thing that I loved about Outskirts. When you guys were doing the long trek, you would just run into this random gent at a bar, and he would, you know, I think there was one guy who just had tattoos of like road signs.
Yeah, Route 66.
Yeah, it's a wild.
Yeah, he's
man,
the Route 66 man.
Yeah, and so like, who is somebody that you've met on the road that you're just like, this is the reason why I do this. I'll never forget this person.
Yeah, he's one of them. And I think like for listeners, it's the gentleman that drives the old Chevy with the Route 66. He's covered in tattoos of Route 66. He's got hundreds of them. I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but his whole body's covered in them. And he's a Vietnam War vet. And he sticks in my mind because he was clearly, you know, in the film, he breaks down. Came back from a war, you know, obviously all the controversy surrounding the Vietnam War, right? And he's undiagnosed PTSD, right? And the way he treats it is driving Route 66, getting these tattoos, and being this character on the road. And that's like both really heartbreaking, and you know, and well, it's heartbreaking because there's this character that can't find his, couldn't kind of deal with these things that he's been through, and the way that he does that is by traveling Route 66, by being a character of that road, of that you know, of that American dream, which has, you know, been in decay for longer than it's been in existence. And so like, you know, he's a character. There's another family that took us in Missouri. One of them, which I don't think he was ever on camera, but one of the gentlemen, one of the members of the family, the eldest one, was on the Supreme Court for 23 years, and oversaw, was like one of the litigators on a class action against a mining company that to do with water contamination, and the birth defects that a portion of these sort of lower socioeconomic communities had suffered. And so, like, you know, like those sort of stories are the ones that stick with me, because like everybody has a remarkable story that until you meet them, you couldn't conceive. And so, like, you know, and then there's the alien, right? The guy that was that, you know, was a former drug cop, you know, then became like was an alcoholic, is homeless. And became, you know, and lives on the road, and he's kind of like all about spreading the positivity, but also too moonlighted for a period there as like a psychedelics mushroom farmer, and like, you know, so like those sort of characters, like just total misfits and total like you know, just total characters that exists, and that, like I said, can kind of provide a perspective on the world that up until that point you couldn't have conceived. So yeah, I think like, you know, though like it's those sort of characters, you know, it's yeah, I mean, it's all of them to a degree, because all of those stories imprint upon you, right? Part of them travels with you, as part of you is like left behind with them, and all of them contribute to forming your opinion, and that's what I think is the most beautiful part of a bike, is the ability to introduce you to these characters that have vastly opposing points of view on politics or on social matters, but you are able to, as a result of the bike, find some level of common ground and that facilitates a conversation. And I think that's a really important thing, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think that's one of the biggest issues that we face right now. Speaking of community and what is community anymore. And anyway, I think that that ability to converse with people that have wildly opposing or just differing points of view, or just these off the wall kind of perspectives on things that, like I said, you couldn't really think of. And so that's, for me, that's the most beautiful thing about the sport of cycling is the ability to facilitate those conversations.
Yeah. And that's amazing. I mean, you've essentially packed around anywhere from, a couple days and 2-3 weeks into a 45-minute video. And you guys are probably trying to meet sponsor obligations and trying not to post anything too crazy, but this is an unfiltered podcast. And I know there's got to be some crazy stories that may have not have made it into the film cut. Is there any crazy stories that you can think about that, would that, I guess, wouldn't get you in too much trouble?
Yeah, well, honestly, like, I was thinking about that.
Yeah.
And like, there's nothing, like, we've been fortunate that there's nothing that hasn't been able to be really included in any of the films. Certainly, a lot of characters, like, don't make the cut because they just, like, the conversation doesn't translate on screen, or there's sort of no place to put it. So, like, I mean, like, there was one night we're in, like, in terms of a crazy story, like, I guess, like, a bizarre story was one night we were in Grand Junction, Colorado, actually, and we were having a drink at a bar, and, like, a bar fight broke out around us, and then like, that bar fight, like, it stopped, and then another one broke out, so they closed the bar, and then we sort of met these people and ended up, like, walking through the suburbs of Grand Junction to this person's house, where we drank this wacky moonshine that, like, that then we left, like, after, I don't know, like, a while there, and we couldn't find our way home, and we didn't get home until, like, 4 a.m. We had 180 Ks to ride the next day. And, like, that moonshine gave us the most savage hangover. Like, it gives me chills thinking about it, and just having to go and ride. So, like, those sort of, like, I guess those sort of things, like we didn't have a camera with us then, and those are the sort of things that happen on the road. And, like, I sort of, like, I guess, like, that's, it's not very wild, but that's probably it. I mean, and then, like I said, the people who you meet, I think in the first film, Rusty was, like, one of the first characters that we met, and he's the old bloke in the first Thereabouts film with the kind of, like, weathered hat, and he's sort of sitting in his backyard, and he speaks real slow like this, and his story, like, he had pancreatic cancer, and he had never traveled to Melbourne, and he was in his late 60s, or maybe in his 70s, and he had to travel further than he never traveled in his life to get treatment for this cancer, and just the experience of doing that, and then like, as a result, he'd become, he's a farmer, and he, as a result of going down and being told that he needed to get pancreatic surgery, he was like, hang on a minute, that doesn't sound right, like, cutting a piece out of me. So he did some research, found other treatments, alternative treatments for that particular type of cancer. He became a vegetarian, I think almost vegan, and he did all of these things that, like, you would never expect a person like that to do. Wow. And it worked. He was in remission. And so, I think like those are the sort of, I guess, the stories that you can never translate on camera, right? To tell that story would take an hour in its own right, and take time, and you've got 20 minutes or 30 minutes with these people as you pass them by. So I guess for me, those are the things that don't make it, that are kind of the most wild, is probably the full story of these characters.
That's interesting. And so to kind of switch gears a little bit, kind of what turned me on to trying to get you onto this podcast we had a guest who pretty much was wanting to come out about their depression in a form, and like you did a physio podcast with Mark Cavendish where you guys kind of open up a little bit on the forefront about mental health, and this guy, I mean, that one podcast, it sounds like it changed his life. Scott Law, which you probably
I know Scotty Law for a long time.
Yeah. So Australian as
Since
well.
we were kids. Yeah.
And he, we got to chatting, and he was like, man, you got to listen to it. You got to check it out. And I listened to it, and it kind of even made me think, you know, it was kind of one of those things where I knew I had bits of depression. We've talked about it. We've had this, but once you listen to somebody else talk about it too, it makes you rethink a little bit about you, and a little bit about the things that you try so hard to mask up. So I guess more or less, like, what are some of your things that you think the professional ranks and the amateur ranks could be doing to kind of help curb this depression in cycling? Because it seems so deep and so heavy right now.
It is. And I mean, that's a really good question. And like, it's a big question. Yeah. And that's something, you know, in the last few years that I've been looking at, and it goes back to what I said about the role of sport in society. And I think that's something that we really need to examine. Like, if you go back to Pierre de Coubertin and the Olympism movement, the modern Olympic Games, the role of you know, what he saw those games playing in society, which is to educate, to unite, to uplift society, and to basically to advance society. And if you fast forward, you know, to now, arguably, you know, does professional sport advance society? And so anyway, so I think like there is a fundamental, question about where sport is at right now that I think needs to be had. Like, the reality of being able to alter that, I think, is to be able to change that, like, is unrealistic. And it's actually like, I have this book here. I'm reading a book at the moment called Small is Beautiful by E.F. Schumacher, and it's a study of economics as if people mattered. So this book was written in the 70s, and to read it now is quite frightening. But there's a page in here, actually, which that's got me thinking. Let me just find my phone.
Yeah, you're good, man.
I just want to grab, because I took a photo of it. I'm never going to find the page in that book. 1 second. Yeah. Because I wanted to find this because this question reminds me of something I read in this book. So he essentially talks about like modern economics, and the idea that the pursuit of infinite wealth, or infinite advancement, like not putting a cap on like what we need to be satisfied, is essentially damaging society, like in a very major way. And I think sport is a really interesting, sorry, I'm just trying to find this. Sport fits into that essentially, where I guess by pursuing performance and by pursuing victory, and in that there being no upper limit on how much success you can have or should want or should pursue, is basically corrupting the entire system. Because obviously when money becomes involved in these things and there is a pursuit to more is better, the athletes tend to go from being human beings to being, I guess, commodities in this structure. So our infinite pursuit of performance, we've neglected the thing that actually makes sport great, which is the humans, which is these characters. If sport was about proving how fast human beings could cover the distance of 100 meters, then we'd use some sort of technology, right? That's some sort of technology that can travel faster than the speed of light, right? It's like pursuing the extreme technological advancement. But sport isn't about that. It's about living, breathing human beings that are, pursuing and doing the things they are, I guess, the best at. And I feel like what's happening is we're dehumanizing these things. So we're removing the human being from these pursuits, and we're kind of discounting the personality. And I think that that's like where the issue becomes, because then, it begs the question of like, well, what's the point of this? What are we really doing? And I don't necessarily think I'm articulating that quite so well, but the point I'm trying to make is I think the issue it stems from basically the nature of professional sport at the moment, and the idea that human beings are a commodity in this, and that your individualism isn't important. The thing that actually makes you human, the personality, your ability to think and to have your own opinions and all of those things are being removed, right? And it's more important to follow a scientific structure, to listen to these mechanical pieces of technology that we add to our human beings, like we're essentially, right, cyborgs, in order to pursue performance. And I think that that's where we've gone wrong, is that we're trying too hard to eliminate the human being from these pursuits. And so what happens to young athletes and old athletes, as we saw with Mark Cavendish, right? He's really experienced depression towards the end of his career, not at the beginning, right? And I think that fundamental nature of what we're pursuing is sort of fucking us up.
Yeah.
And so like, how do you neglect? Like, how does sport in its current model address that? Well, I think there's a couple of things. I think the first thing it needs to do is it needs to talk about it. It needs to acknowledge that it exists, and then it needs to seek counsel on the best way to address those. It needs to put people in place. And there are sports psychs and there are these type of characters, but I don't think they're doing enough in terms of calling the system out. They're not doing enough in terms of providing, more than just words of advice for these athletes. And I think, so I think like that's, I think we need to have those structures in place. I also think then it comes down to these people, these funding bodies, these like sponsors and the people that are providing money need to recognize, and there's huge potential, like, to leverage the character of athletes over just their performance. In a sport where there's, or in all sport, but like there's hundreds of athletes, sport rewards like the very least possible amount of people that it has to.
Yeah.
It rewards the person who crosses the finish line first. That's the least amount of people that it can possibly reward, right? And so I think like by showcasing, and if you look at what EF are doing with the alternate program, and I'm sort of speaking more specifically to cycling here, I think, because that's sort of what I know best. But they're sort of showcasing the character of these athletes and their unique perspectives and their kind of accumulated knowledge and experience, and they're allowing them to have that voice and to showcase those sort of things. And so I think, and then they've demonstrated that there's an audience for that. So I think sponsors putting money behind the characters, and really valuing the human being behind the performance, and then I think that's a big thing. And then I also think too, like, having people in place to help athletes begin to transition out of their careers. Because I think one thing that's really hard that athletes face is you go all in, right? You're like, I'm going all in on this. And you don't, you might be making 20 grand a year. You might be making 10 grand a year. You might be paying your way at a shot. And the pressure that has on you, is huge. And you've got to forego all these other things. You've got to forego education. You've got to forego work, right? You've got to forego like developing any sort of a backup for a majority of people. And so therefore, like, you're then stuck, and it's like, well, this is all I've got. This is all I can do. And so I think there needs to be, right from the get-go, someone there for athletes to be able to go, okay, I know that you're 20 and you've got potentially 20 years of cycling ahead of you, but, there's the potential that there won't be.
Yeah, yeah.
And exactly right. And also too, like, not only that, but like, I think like, cause that's like the idea that being like, oh, you could have an injury
Mm.
and that ends your career. But it's like, well, what if you wake up one morning and you decide that you don't want to do this anymore? Like, no one talks about that. So I think like showing athletes that there is a way out and that there is another way to participate in sport that can be as fulfilling, but it might not be your career or that sort of thing.
Well, that's so
Um,
fun. That's so funny that you put it like that, because I remember when I came into the sport super late,
mhm.
and I came in at the age of like 19, 20, and I started to surround myself with these pro cyclists who are about the same age as me. So I'm a Cat 5, and I'm hanging out with guys on Hincapie and all this stuff. And
Yep.
I want to be them. And I'm
Yep.
looking up to these other cyclists too that I want to be. And I want to be these athletes. And then I get to know them. And I get to
Mm.
really know them. And I see them about to lose their job. And then I
Mm.
see them lose their job. And I see what they're doing now, or what they did when they lost their job, just waking up at 11. Like, and it didn't really click with me. I was just like, what are they doing? These are some of the best cyclists I've ever, like, how can they do this? And I didn't really put into perspective what they did before, and like what
Mm.
it took to get there, and how hard it is to be at this level. And then all of a sudden it's gone
Yeah.
with no plan, um, no backup, no school. Some of them homeschooled in high school. So social aspects and interviewing aspects are gone. I mean, and that was one thing that, and it's going to be really shitty, but me and my wife at the time, she was my girlfriend, but when we were going in and hang out with these people, we'd go to parties or functions, when they would talk to girls or just other individuals, we were just like, bro, what is happening here? And it's something that I never knew, because I was a football player, I was a wrestler, I was in high school, I was in a 1,000-person school. And so I think that even goes back, and which, if you guys haven't listened to the podcast with Fabian Kinchelar, that's what he's trying to do as well,
Mm.
which is amazing.
And that's like, exactly, it's like figuring out, and that, I mean, that's the thing, is like your professional career is only a small part of your life.
Yeah.
And also too, like, it shouldn't be who you are. It shouldn't define you.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it can define part of you. It can define a period of your life. Absolutely. But like, the idea that that is all you are is so reductive and really sad. And that's where sport is at, because that's what it requires. It requires you to be homeschooled. It requires you to, like, you know, go all in, and it requires you to move countries, to sacrifice all of these other elements that are really vital to learning, like conversation, like debate, like all of those things that you get, you know, just by virtue of participating in society more broadly. You know, when you've got to train and you've got this regimen and you've got to eat a certain way, you know, going out to a restaurant, like going and hanging out with friends at a barbecue, you know, going for a hike, you know, staying up late one night, like all of those things become a burden,
Mm-hmm.
because it's like, oh, I'm taking away, like, me being here right now is actually taking away from my ability to win the Tour de France in 5 years' time, potentially.
Yeah.
When it's not, but nor, like, you know, but like, that shouldn't be, it shouldn't be that way.
Yeah.
And it is. And look, like, it was always going to be that, when, as I said before, when our pursuit is infinite, you know, like, when the pursuit of victory is infinite and it's never ending, and there's no sort of like cap on what is deemed successful, you know, you can always be more successful, and that's a noble pursuit. And it's not, it shouldn't be that way. There should be, you know, all of these other factors, and all of these other, you know, elements that fit into that. And I would argue that, like, sport now, like, it's reaching a point where it's to its detriment. And I think, you know, like, the number of people that talk about, oh, world tour cycling is boring, and like, they need to do something to kind of change the format, or let's eliminate, you know, power meters, or like all those things. You're like, no, that's not what's going to fix the sport. It's like, we need to care about it.
Mm-hmm.
I need to care, right? Like, I'm just trying to think of, like, you know, like, I guess, you know, there's examples throughout history in sport. Like, you think of like Eddie Merckx and Fausto Coppi and like all these things. And like, Eddie Merckx's victories were amazing, but like, he's equally as famous for his wacky training and like the wacky things that he said. And like, you know, the kind of like experimentation, the things that he would do, that's what made him a character. That's what made him larger than life.
Yeah.
And I think that that's being like, to a degree, it's not even being stifled. Like it is being stifled, like kind of directly by how media trained athletes are, what they can and can't talk about. Like, but I still think there is wiggle room for character to come through. But I just think by virtue of what the sport requires of you, it kills those things off.
Yeah.
You know, like, so anyway, so I think like, you know, if like anyone who's pursuing the sport at that absolute top level, like I would always encourage them to try to balance that some way, right? Try to maintain a friendship group that don't know anything about the sport of cycling. Have mentors, right? Like have people that you can reach out to, that you can ask for advice. Have people that, you know, like that value you for you and not for your cycling result, and they encourage you and they push you to do things that you don't necessarily want to do. And like, you know, because I think it's about trying to find a balance there, and that's not easy. And then, like I said, on the sporting side, I think they really need to pony up. They need to have a union, you know, that's actually effective. They need to have a fucking pension that actually can pay out, that isn't mismanaged by a bunch of incompetent fools. And they also need to have programs like that of former Olympic rower Gerard Toei, which transition athletes out of sport, and they start transitioning them about years before they do. Because I can tell you, man, like having stopped sport twice, you just like, you go from doing something, you go from having a goal every day. My goal is 5 hours and I've got to do these 3 intervals in it. And if I do that, my day's a success. There's no other job. There's no other vocation that has such clearly defined goals.
Yeah.
So you go and find a job, and I don't know, like you're working through the day, and you get to the end of the day and you're like, did I complete everything I could have completed? Like,
Yeah.
can I give today a green light, or is it still a red light, or is it like an amber light? And that's really, that's really hard.
Yeah.
Because you go from having all of these affirmations throughout your day. You ate well, you know, you did this, you did this, you did, like, okay, I've done it all. Whereas when you come out to the real world, things aren't black and white like that. And so it's really hard to adapt. And I don't think athletes are trained to be able to do that. Like you hear of athletes now that their teams plan out their daily schedule. Like you eat at this time, and then you need to wait X number, and then you train this way, and then you do this, and like, so they don't have to even think about what to eat, when to eat, do anything. What happens to that person when they retire?
It's wild.
You know, like,
yeah.
You don't know how you, like, it sounds stupid, but like, you know, you're like, well, if I don't have to eat oatmeal for breakfast, what do I eat?
Yeah.
You know?
Well, I thought it's funny
so.
that you mentioned that, because it was Alex Howes. He made a comment about, I think, some French team that he rode for, where they measured out the food that he had in a race, and that was it. That's what they decided. That's what you're eating during the race. You don't get any hungrier during the race, and you eat that. And like, that to me is like, that is scary. Like, not even on the front of body dysmorphia and eating disorders, but also on the front of the fact that you are now thinking what the rider is going to need. And that to me is very scary. But dude, we're taking up a ton of your time, and I don't want to hold you up too long. So I want to get one last segment in, and this is the big one. Do this every week with every guest. If you could have coffee with one individual, who would that be, dead or alive? How would you take your coffee, and why?
So this is a tough one, right?
Yeah.
So like, I had to give this some thought, to be honest, but like, so I thought about this, and I thought, well, most of the people I admire or look up to, like, I don't know if I'd actually want to have coffee with them.
Whoa,
right?
Really?
Like, think about this. Like, what do you say to Stanley Kubrick over coffee? Right. So Stanley Kubrick, film director, made films like Eyes Wide Shut, 2001, The Shining. Like what do you ask him? Right. So it's like, he made the film The Shining, and he said, after he made that film, that The Shining is a film that's meant to be watched both forward and backward. And so it's like, what do you say? Like, oh, can you break that down for me? And you've got until the end of this piccolo latte. to
Yeah.
do that, right? Anyway, or like Nelson Mandela,
Yeah.
like Nelson Mandela, speak about the role of sport in a post-apartheid South Africa, right? And by the way, you know, you've got 30 mils of espresso to break that down. So it's like, and like, you know what I mean? Like it's intimidating is what I'm trying to say. Like,
oh yeah, for sure.
So anyway, so all of that, those are two people I would definitely like to do that, but like, I don't know if I would have the courage to, but one person 100% that I would love to have been able to have sat down and had coffee with is Anthony Bourdain.
Okay.
His death hit me really hard. And I very much looked up to him. I think, you know, incredible humanitarian, wonderfully flawed champion. And I see the role of sport much like he saw the role of food, as a way to help us understand the world, as a way to, you know, bring people together and to learn and to educate and to kind of break down barriers. And so, yeah, for me, I think like really, you know, yeah, like he saw food in the way that I see sport, and so he is someone that I really feel like I could just sit down and have a chin wag with over a cup of coffee, and that would be amazing.
Sweet. Yeah. So how would you take your coffee? Are you just kind of like whatever is on the
I'm a drip coffee, dark roast, the burnt the better, and in a larger cup. A big cup.
That's very American of you, man.
It is. American. I used to be a coffee wank. Yeah. I used to be a coffee wank. You know, as many a bike rider are, you don't have much else to do but think about what sort of coffee you're going to order. And but you know, since I've lived in the States, there's a level of nostalgia. I have a very strong affection for roadside diners.
Waffle House coffee, baby.
And for the people you meet there. And so I think, you know, for me, every sip of a house brew is, takes me back to some of my fondest memories. So yeah, that's me.
That's awesome. Well, Gus, thank you so much, man, for jumping on the podcast. I'm super stoked about this. And yeah, guys, all the links to his podcast, the PSYO podcast with Bobby Ulick, is going to be in the link description below, as well as Outskirts, Thereabouts, and his social media. So be sure to check that out. Other than that, guys, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.